Well, if the general who commanded Donald Trump's army gets 22 years in federal prison for what he did on January 6th, what does the commander-in-chief of Donald Trump's army get if he is found guilty? That is the question that Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers are thinking about tonight with the breaking news that the leader of the so-called Proud Boys was sentenced to 22 years for his leadership of what prosecutors called Donald Trump's army on January 6th. When Enrique Tarrio completes his 22-year sentence, he will be 1 year away from eligibility for Social Security retirement benefits, unless Republicans have raised the retirement age in the meantime. But the 39-year-old Enrique Tarrio will not be earning any Social Security credits while in prison, and he can be absolutely sure Donald Trump won't be around to help out when Enrique Tarrio gets out of prison. Today, Cuban-American Enrique Tarrio from Florida got the longest sentence ever given to someone who committed crimes for the President of the United States. 2 of the 5 men convicted in the 1972 Watergate burglary to help President Richard Nixon were right-wing Cuban Americans like Enrique Tarrio. They were sentenced to 1 to 4 years and served 13 months and 15 months. Enrique Tarrio has already served more prison time than that in his criminal past. He served 16 months in federal prison beginning in 2013. After that, he became an informer, helping investigators prosecute his former associates. Tonight, if there's anyone out there still foolishly calling himself a Proud Boy who has not yet been accused of crimes, don't be surprised if Enrique Tarrio testifies against you someday in the hope of reducing his 22-year sentence. Prosecutors asked for enhancements to Tarrio's sentence, including a terrorism enhancement, but they told the judge meant that Tarrio should be sentenced to 33 years in prison. Judge Timothy Kelly recognized the technical applicability of the terrorism enhancement, but Judge Kelly decided not to add that to the sentence. Judge Kelly served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia for 10 years. He then worked as a litigator in a major Washington law firm. He decided to become a member of the Federalist Society 12 years after graduating from law school, and then he had the easiest possible ride to confirmation as a federal judge after serving on the staff of the Senate Judiciary Committee as a counsel to Republican chairman of the committee, Chuck Grassley. Chairman Grassley got Tim Kelly nominated as a federal judge in the 4th month of the Trump presidency. His confirmation sailed through the Judiciary Committee with a unanimous vote and got 94 votes on the Senate floor. Judge Kelly had to know that if Donald Trump were to win the next presidential election, Judge Kelly would have absolutely no chance of being elevated by Donald Trump to the Circuit Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court after issuing a 22-year sentence to the leader of Donald Trump's army. No future Republican president is likely to reward Judge Kelly with a promotion. And so, in a sense, Judge Kelly also sentenced himself today to a career as a federal district judge who will probably never be promoted. In fact, most federal district judges are never promoted. There simply aren't enough appeals court openings to ever allow for that, and very few federal judges ever have to make a decision that they know will end even the theoretical possibility of being promoted. Judge Kelly did that today. You can spend a lifetime in the federal courts and never see that happen. But this is the age of Trump, full of things we've never seen before. Also today, there was a mystery filing by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith in the case of United States of America versus Donald Trump. The motion could not say publicly what it is actually about, quote, because the motion refers to sensitive materials. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers opposed Jack Smith's motion. Jack Smith's motion says that the Trump lawyers were trying to, quote, grind litigation in this case to a halt, which is particularly infeasible given the pressing matters before the court, including the defendant's daily extrajudicial statements that threaten to prejudice the jury pool in this case, as described in the government's motion. So we do now know that the motion that we have not been allowed to see does contain sensitive materials and a description of, quote, the defendant's daily extrajudicial statements that threaten to prejudice the jury pool in this case. Judge Tanya Chutkan gave the defense lawyers a deadline of Monday, September 11th to file a secret motion in opposition, and gave Jack Smith a deadline of September 13th to file his response secretly to the defendant's secret motion. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., we might learn a lot publicly, a lot about how the Georgia prosecution of Donald Trump and his 18 co-defendants might eventually be organized. The Georgia judge assigned to the case, Scott McAfee, will hold a hearing at 1 p.m. tomorrow on the motions by two co-defendants to sever their cases from the rest of the defendants. The two co-defendants seeking to sever their cases are attorney Kenneth Chesebro and attorney Sidney Powell. In a notice to both sides in the case, Judge McAfee wrote that he intends to ask District Attorney Fani Willis to provide, quote, a good faith estimate of the time reasonably anticipated to present the state's case during a joint trial of all 19 co-defendants, and alternatively, any divisions thereof, including the number of witnesses likely to be called and the number and size of exhibits likely to be introduced.